Haynes has only to nod it in.
The earliest evidence for an activity recognized as a form of football is from 3rd century BC during the Han Dynasty in China. It was a simple ball game known as tsuju, where the objective was to kick a leather ball through a small hole in a piece of cloth positioned a couple of meters above ground. It was originally used and intended as a military exercise, but the popularity of the game quickly spread among the upper class. The game later spread to other nations and also inspired the Japanese game Kemari, in which people stand in a circle trying to keep a ball in the air by kicking it for as long as possible. It's essentially the same as kick-ups but with slightly different rules. End quotes. Evidence for ancient games similar to football has also been found in places like Greece and Italy, but it wasn't until the 9th century that modern-day football truly began to take shape. Between the 9th and 13th century, an activity known as medieval or mob football spiked in popularity in England, Scotland, and France. Mob football is exactly what it sounds like. Large mobs, usually entire villages, would compete against each other trying to get a small object like an inflated animal bladder to a specific location. And with the exception of murder and manslaughter, almost anything was allowed to complete this objective. The games got so violent and disruptive to non-participants that in 1314, King Edward II issued a proclamation banning football in London. Many attempts to ban the games would follow in all 3 countries, but the bans were not very effective as people just kept on playing in secret. Beginning in the 16th century, a slightly different and familiar form of football were being played at public schools across England. It was a lot less violent than regular mob football, and more strict regulations were soon established. Things like only being allowed to use your feet, having a referee and a coach, passing, dribbling, and having a goal with a designated goalkeeper on each end of the playing field. Football began to transform into an organized sport rather than a chaotic riot. The problem was that each school developed its own version of the game with slightly different rules. For example, at rugby school, they preferred a more violent game where you could tackle your opponents and still carry the ball in your arms and hands, and thus rugby and gridiron football was born.
The field is marked out in 5-yard spaces. That's why they call it gridiron. It's a cross between a chess game and a friendly homicide.
Increasing attempts to unify and reconcile the various public school games were made, and in 1848 the first written rules were penned at the University of Cambridge. These rules became widely adopted, and in 1863 the Football Association was founded in London to continue to promote football under a unified set of regulations. As the sport became increasingly popular all over the globe, a need for an international association became apparent, and thus FIFA was founded in France in 1904. Today, it's estimated that 3.5 billion people, or half the population of the entire globe, are fans of football. Why is it that countries like the US and Canada insist on calling the sport soccer, while the rest of the world calls it football? It also makes a lot less sense to call a sport football when it mostly consists of using your hands, but it does make a bit more sense if you know where it came from. Calling the sport soccer actually began back in England, and here's why. As the Football Association was founded in London in 1863, the sport became officially known as Association Football. That was and still is the full title of the sport. This was done to distinguish association football from other variations of the game, such as rugby football and Gaelic football. But using the full titles in conversation can be a bit tedious, so shorthand names were used in their place. And a popular conversational form of creating abbreviations at the time was by applying the suffix ER. So rugby football became rugger, and association football became footer or soccer, often spelled with a CK at the time. So the word soccer comes from the abbreviation of the word association, found in the full title of the sport, Association Football. In 1998, a match in the capital of the Democratic Republic of Congo was suddenly disrupted by a lightning strike. Now, lightning strikes during football matches are not exactly unheard of, but this one was definitely a unique case. Not only did half the players on the field die as a result of being struck by lightning, they were all from the same team. The other team remarkably left the match completely unharmed. The local population, known to believe in things like charms and spells, was divided over whether or not the team was cursed, and what further fueled this rumor was that the game was tied 1-1 at the time of the incident, and the team that died was the visiting team. The record for the highest scoreline of all time in professional football occurred in 2002 in Madagascar and ended with a score of 149-0. However, the reason for this absurd amount of goals was that the players of the losing team kept on kicking the ball into their own goal. They did this as a protest against a referee decision. The previous record occurred in 1885 with a scoreline of 36-0. The record for the largest victory in an international football match happened in 2001 between Australia and American Samoa with a scoreline of 31-0. Just like the game in 1885, the reason for the high score counts were because of the team's skill level being incredibly mismatched. To a lot of people, football is a big deal. In places like Brazil, for example, it's more or less comparable to a religion. And just like a religion, this extreme passion for the sport can lead to some quite extreme situations. A perfect example of this is the 1950 FIFA World Cup hosted in Brazil. In the finals, it was Brazil up against Uruguay. For multiple days prior to the match, both the press and the general public assumed that Brazil would come out as the world champions. The organizers of the event had even prepared a speech for when Brazil ultimately won. To everyone's surprise, Brazil lost the match with a final score of 2-1, resulting in one of the biggest upsets in football history. So much so that some fans actually committed suicide by throwing themselves off the stands at the stadium, and a noticeable wave of suicides were reported in the days that followed. Brazilian newspapers and radio hosts even tried to ignore or deny the fact that they had been defeated. The entire thing has become known as Maracanazo after the name of the stadium. Even more dramatic, the 1970 FIFA World Cup prompted a war between two nations. In 1969, Honduras and El Salvador met during the qualification round for the upcoming World Cup. Honduras won the first game with a score of 1-0, which sparked a lot of violence among the fans. El Salvador would go on to win the second game with a score of 3-0, which ignited another wave of riots and violence. Finally, a playoff match took place which ended with El Salvador as the winner with a score of 3-2. Now, before all of this, these two nations were not exactly friends. Issues over land reform, immigration, and democratic problems were all rampant long before these games ever took place. So when El Salvador won the final game, Hondurans began assaulting and harassing Salvadoran immigrants all across the country as a sort of retaliation for losing the game. El Salvador, seeing this as a form of genocide, dissolved all democratic relations with Honduras the very same day and launched an attack on the nation only 2 weeks after the final match. The war lasted for 4 days until a ceasefire was signed, at which point more than 2,000 people had died. Because of this, it's become known as the Football War. The oldest football ball still in existence was found during an excavation project at Stirling Castle in Scotland. It's believed to be around 450 years old and is made out of a pig's bladder and cow leather. Whenever the Mexican player Javier Hernandez plays a match, crime rates in Mexico actually drop significantly. Mexican police has discovered that criminals across the country take a break from criminal activities to watch this national hero play a match. Crimes like carjackings, muggings, and robberies all have a noticeable drop whenever he's on TV. Not only that, but his appearance in a match even increases Mexico's birth rates.
The game you're about to see is the most stupid, appalling, disgusting and disgraceful exhibition of football possibly in the history of the game.
During the 1962 FIFA World Cup, a game between Chile and Italy became infamously known as the Battle of Santiago. Tension between the two nations and teams had built up long before the game began, and as a result, the players became rather violent during the game. The first attack happened only 12 seconds after the match began, and later in the game one player even performed a dropkick style maneuver. The referee during the game was Ken Aston, who did his best to control the increasingly violent players. As a direct result of this violent match, Ken Aston later introduced the idea of using yellow and red cards as a means of penalizing a player. Apparently the idea came to him as he drove down a street and saw the green, yellow and red traffic lights. In 1863, the newly formed Football Association in England stated that goalposts for a goal should be 24 feet apart, a rule which still stands to this day. However, nothing was said of the height of the goal. The height was usually indicated by a string between the two posts, but could theoretically be limitless, meaning that a goal could be scored at any height as long as the ball passed in between the two posts. Of course, not having a standardized rule for the height resulted in arguments and disagreements. It wasn't until 1882 that a solid crossbar was required at a height of 8 feet, which remains true to this day. However, it is still not a requirement, only mandated for a goal in association football to have a net.